Okay, good evening. Open up your Bibles to Leviticus 1. I'm going to spend a little bit of time there, and then we'll kind of move around a little bit. I've only taught Leviticus a few times, but the times that I have taught it, I've tried to teach it thematically. There are four main themes in the book of Leviticus, and I think it's probably the best approach is to teach it that way. Last week we talked about one of the themes, which I think is really important to understand the second theme. So last week we talked about the idea of holiness, and this week we're going to talk about the presence of God. And I think that it's very difficult to understand God's presence apart from understanding His holiness. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time just sort of reviewing a little bit of the concept of holiness. And then I think that'll kind of segue nicely into just thinking about God's presence. It's easy as New Testament Christians to sort of understand God's presence as just, a very easy thing and something that doesn't require a lot from us, that we just enjoy His presence. And that's fine to see it that way, but you really need to see the way the Israelites understood the presence of God. And I think that will give us a better base for how we enjoy God's presence now. God's presence was not necessarily an enjoyable thing through Scripture. And what I mean by that, I'm not saying that God's presence is bad. I'm saying that God's presence is bad for people who are unprepared for it. And God's presence is intended to be a blessing. And it is a blessing in the fact that it brings judgment. And what we tend to focus on is that God's presence brings goodness and blessing. And we sort of don't pay attention to the fact that God's presence also brings judgment and justice. And those are things that actually we should want. Those are things that are good, not bad. So when we look back to the God of Israel, we sort of, we do the blame game, like, why is there such fierce judgment of God among the people around Israel? I mean, there are stories that are pretty horrific in the Old Testament about how God deals with the nations who oppress Israel, and there are some stories about how He deals with His own people sometimes that are pretty harsh. And I think if you don't see God's presence as being that twofold, and I brought this up a couple of times now, Romans 11:22, behold then the kindness and severity of God. And what Paul is saying is that it's easy for us to pay attention to only one of those things. And you're wrong if you just simply magnify one and you don't pay attention to both. You have to see that God is the judge and that God provides. And both of those are great. We don't want to live in a world without judgment. We don't want to live in a world that doesn't have punishment for sin. I mean, we do, as long as it's not towards other people. We want other people to enjoy that punishment. We just don't want to enjoy it ourselves. But God can't be God if He's not dealing with sin appropriately across the spectrum. And this is what makes it difficult for us to understand holiness and the presence of God. So the idea of holiness, remember we had that little chart last week where we showed things that are holy and things that are common. And common can be divided into two things. There's clean and unclean, and then there's things that are vile and apart from God. And so there's ways and there's terminology in Leviticus and other places, Deuteronomy, that tell us how something that is common, that chart, thank you. So how something that is clean can become holy, how something that's clean can become unclean. And so there's processes in Leviticus that tell us that, hey, if you cleanse this a certain number of times, it becomes holy, it becomes sanctified and purposeful. Do you realize that that's exactly what God was doing when He pulls Israel out of Egypt? He is giving them, and He's defining them and giving them purpose. I mean, do you remember that in the numbering of the people, one of the things that happens is He gives them jobs, right? He gives them identity markers, like this is what you're going to do, and you're responsible for this, right? You know what that is? That's giving people purpose, giving people identity. The identity, first and foremost, is what? You're the people of God. You belong to me. So he brings them to Mount Sinai. They don't touch the mountain. They don't want to, nor are they allowed to, because that's the presence of God, right? So they veer away and they say, hey, Moses, why don't you go and talk to God, because we're all scared, right? And so Moses does that, and he brings it up later a couple of different times and says, hey, remember when you guys were all scaredy cats? That's fine, but I was your mediator, and God has come down, and here's his presence. And really, from the point of Exodus 19 and 20, where God has them build the tabernacle, and then the end of Exodus, that's what they're doing, is they're building the tabernacle, making all the stuff that goes in the tabernacle, so that what? So that God's presence won't be on the mountain, it will be in the camp. And from that point on, then God meets with his people, and he speaks to them through Moses. But before that, he's distant. And the ancient peoples all had this concept of gods and it's very pagan to understand God as apart and uncaring and distant. And God, our God, the true God, the creator of all things, never wanted his people to be distant from him. But the pagans worship gods who want that. And the people want to be distant from their God because their gods are gods of wrath and revenge. But Jehovah God is not that. And so you see the presence of God through the ancient peoples kind of being filtered through Moses' understanding of God. So you have holy, clean, and unclean. And things that are unclean cannot become holy. They can become clean, and then maybe they can become holy. And so holy, the people of God were holy in that they were sanctified and they were given purpose. So their purpose was to do what? Like if you were to really, truly iron out what God's people, the Israelites, were to do, what would you, like in just a phrase, what was it? It was to be the image bearers of God, right? To bring God, Jehovah God's presence into the world. How can you bring something into the world that you'd have never known or enjoyed, right? So that's why he comes to dwell with them. Somebody has to be a mediator. So there's lots of mediation happening here. Moses is mediating for the people, isn't he? And then he sets up Aaron. Aaron is mediating for the people, Aaron and his sons, right? And now it's the priesthood, and they're mediating for Israel. But Israel is mediating as well, aren't they? They're representing God to the people and to the people around them, the nations around them, and they're representing those nations to God. And that's what Moses' job is. So you see these levels of holiness and levels of mediation are going hand in hand. And essentially, isn't that what's happening in the church today? That your job as a Christian isn't just holy living. Holy living is like the beginning place. But if all we do is practice our faith unto ourselves, we haven't really accomplished anything, have we? The whole point of our whole, you can't do that unless two things happen. Number one, you have to have experienced the presence of God yourself. You can't go out into the world and claim that let me tell you about Jesus Christ when you don't know anything about him. Does that make sense? And I think that's what a lot of times we try to do, is we speak of God's grace and mercy, and we're the most unmerciful people there are. And let me tell you something, I'm experiencing something in my life this week that I've never experienced. Somebody called me very late on Sunday night. At 2 a.m, I never went to bed on Sunday night because this ruckus in this family who I'm very close to. And I was up all night, sort of mediating. And I've been doing it all week. And what I'm witnessing, what I'm seeing is a complete lack of God's mercy. They're at war because of something pretty serious that's happened. And I mean, my take on it is, where's God's grace? You know, your number one job as a believer is to practice what God has given to you. You're a sinner. Hey, big heads up here. You're a sinner. If you can't be gracious to other people who are also sinners, how do you deserve the grace that God's giving you? And I'm witnessing this like war in this family that's absolutely ripping it apart. And there's no grace. It's horrible. You know, when Kenneth was talking about Satan being active, I'm like, I'm seeing it firsthand. It's awful. We are to be practitioners of mercy. If I can't be forgiving of somebody who's wronged me, who can? I don't deserve what God's done for me. Easier said than done. And so that's where like practice matters. And you know what? God gives us trial, honestly, to build up our immunity to the wrongs that people do to us. That's your practice field so that you can do better the next time and display God's grace and mercy. What the Israelites were doing was they were practicing something that would actually be enacted through Christ. So they're slitting the throats of animals. In other words, taking out the brunt of the sin on some poor little animal. You know why the animal could never actually be the right sacrifice? I mean, the main thing is it's not voluntary, right? We've talked about that. That's a big part of what the Hebrew writer is going to hit on. We're going to read a couple passages out of the Hebrews. That's one of the main things that happens with Christ that could not have happened before. Literally, what the Israelites are doing is they're covering sin. So when they go on the Day of Atonement, Leviticus 16, you know what they're doing? The high priest is going in and he's taking blood of animals and he's smearing it on things because the blood is what? The life. And he's taking life and covering things that are death. Do you understand that? That's actually quite literally what's happening. He's taking life and putting it on top of death so that when God views it, he can somehow ignore the death that's underneath it. Is the death still there? Yeah. So that's, in a very real sense, exactly what's happening. So they cover everything with blood, and then the high priest goes in and he touches all the different parts with blood. They smear it everywhere. They use blood and they use smoke. Before he actually goes into the true presence of God in the Holy of Holies that one day a year, you remember the last thing that he does before he enters? It's in Leviticus 16. And I know Mike said he read the entire book for last week and he was disappointed that there wasn't a quiz. And I actually intended to have a quiz for Mike this week and I totally botched it. So next week, the last thing that he does before he goes in the Holy of Holies is he takes some incense and right in front of the veil that goes from the holy place to the most holy place is an altar of incense. And he takes some coal and incense and throws it on top of that fire and a big huge cloud of smoke comes off and he walks in. And it's just sort of, I think that the idea is that he's being kind of covered and hidden by the smoke, you know, because the presence of God is here. And here he is, a person who's trying to practice holiness and not doing it perfectly probably, and walks into the presence of God. You know, they actually tied something to his ankle. Did you know that? They tied a cord around his ankle with bells on it just in case he tripped, you know, in case he fell over dead. Not because he trips, but because he falls over dead, they can like get him out and they don't have to go in and, you know, isn't that crazy? But that's actually how they dealt with it. Here's what's interesting about it is that every time they would move camp, didn't people have to go into that same area and tear it down? But what had happened right before that? God's presence would leave the tabernacle so that they could tear the house down and move it somewhere else. And he would be in the form of a cloud of fire or smoke, right? Out in front of them, leading them. They would get to the new place. They would set up the tabernacle and he would go in. And there's actually stories about how that little transferal that happens. And one of them is when they set up the tabernacle in Exodus 19 and 20, that God's presence comes into the tabernacle for the first time. And the way it's described is that it takes up so much room that the priests had to like move their way out of the tabernacle. So it's like, you know, it's almost like God's like girding up his robes or something. I don't know. He goes into the tabernacle and the smoke fills the tabernacle and they actually have to step out. The same thing happens when Solomon dedicates the temple, which is the new presence of God. That when he comes into that, it's like 2 Chronicles 7 is where that story is, and also I think 1 Kings 8. And when those two stories, there are different versions of the same story, but when God comes into the temple, the same thing happens, that the priests actually have to make their exit from the tabernacle because God's presence is so consuming and so vast, and so they leave. So what is the presence of God? It's not something that's just, I want to be, it's not just the positive. The people of Israel were frightened. They were scared, literally scared to death, right? And every time God's presence enters into people's lives, there's almost an apology made by God. Hey, don't be afraid. I'm not going to hurt you. I mean, you've never ever been in the presence of something like that, have you? I mean, the closest thing I can think of is like if I was driving like some little Beetle or something and, you know, a semi with a huge crane on it was like interfering in my lane. You know, I don't even have a chance against this thing. Good thing is I drive a bigger truck, so I mean, I'd probably take it out. But I mean, if you're driving some little tiny car, you're in trouble, right? You actually you're coming off the road or you're getting smashed. And when God's presence comes into the lives of people, there's almost it's not an apology, but it's like, you know, God has to say, don't worry, I'm not going to try to hurt you. Not try. I'm not going to hurt you. And so Leviticus is actually trying to explain this. I'm trying to explain to us the problem of the burning bush. I presented that question last week. The burning bush is, if you look up the presence of God, like stories that help us understand the presence of God, the burning bush is going to be one of the top stories that's going to come up on your search engine. But it illustrates something more than just simply the presence of God. It illustrates the problem that all of the rest of the Pentateuch is trying to explain. You remember how I worded that to you last week? I was trying to form it in a question. Do you remember what we were talking about? Moses recognized it, and he actually asked the right question. He said he was going to turn aside and see this because what? He didn't understand how an all-consuming fire could exist in a bush and not burn it up. Have you thought about that at all this last week? It's actually a humongous, deep question. Do you know what it's illustrating? What is it showing? What is that question showing? Go ahead, Ann.
It's God in us.
Right. It's God among his people. How can a holy God be among his people? So in the beginning story in Exodus 3, God is through narrative telling a humongous question, a paradox, and saying, hey, I'm going to answer this question for you. How can this fire be in this bush? These are two things that are incompatible. They can't be in the same place at the same time. Same thing with God being holy and his people probably not. And so there's these repeat commands all throughout the scripture. Be holy as I am holy, right? Do you think that that's an Old Testament principle? It's not an Old Testament principle, right? I mean, it began there, but doesn't it continue into the New Testament? We're going to look at some passages that say, I mean, if you're not aware of it, you should be. Yeah, it continues in the New Testament that you're supposed to be holy. Now, I would say this, that it's clear that we worship God under a different circumstance, and that holiness is not a figment of imagination at this point. I'm not made holy because of my perfect law keeping. And that's the advantage that we have. What those people back then were looking forward to, and what the sacrifices were pointing to, was Jesus. And he would eliminate all of that and give us willpower. It is up to God to create in us will. That's what Philippians says, that God creates the will within us to live well So this is totally on God and not on us. But what is on us is being subject to him and putting him first and saying, hey, what you want in my life, that's what's going to happen. So let me show you how holiness and the presence of God sort of work together in Leviticus, and then we're going to look at some New Testament passages as well. So there's a key phrase that happens in Leviticus, and I was thinking I would write all these out, but what I would do is this. If you have a Vines, you know what a Vines is? Or a Strong's? If you look up the phrase before the Lord in either one, and you find the phrase before the Lord, what you'll find is about 90 to 100 times in Leviticus alone, the phrase before the Lord is used. So just think about that for a second. Before the Lord. So the first 5 chapters of Leviticus are about sacrifices. So Leviticus is really just it's a liturgical book. It's a text on how can you become holy. So it's actually a how-to book for the Israelites on how they can be in the presence of God. So Leviticus is actually explaining the paradox that happens in Exodus 3 where the burning bush and fire are happening at the same time. Leviticus is trying to explain to them, here's what you have to do to be in the presence of God. And in those instructions, around 100 times, the phrase before the Lord. So for an example, the scriptures will say something like, they're supposed to sacrifice this animal before the Lord, right? They're supposed to wash this before the Lord. They're supposed to wear these garments before the Lord. So not going into any of the specific texts of that, does that speak to you at all, that phrase before the Lord? Just think for just a second, why in a liturgical book, a book that is literally just a rehearsal of all the do's and don'ts for the priesthood specifically, but for the people in general, why is the phrase before the Lord so important? Just take a stab at it. This is not actually a complex answer that I'm looking for. Just take a stab at it. Why do you think it's there? Yep. You weren't here for the intro to talk about what the title of the class was, Tom? We're talking about the presence of God. So yeah, you're right. It is to remind them that they are with the things they do in the tabernacle are always before the Lord. It's, the reminder of God is right here watching what you're doing. Remember last week we talked about those 2 guys, the sons of Aaron? What were their names? Yeah, remember about Nadab and Abihu? So in the story in Exodus where God asks for the leaders of the people to come up on the mountain, there are 4 names mentioned, Moses and Aaron and Nadab and Abihu. And then by the time you get to Leviticus 10, this nasty story is told about these 2 guys, right? And the story is that they used, a fire that was not authorized. And so for years, we have used that story to illustrate the meanness of God. And it's not illustrating that at all. It's this fire that consumes is a fire that consumes things that are not holy. And when 2 people come before God who are supposed to know what is holy and are supposed to have reverence for the presence of God, and then they flaunt something that was clearly specified otherwise, then is it God's revenge on them? Or is it just a natural thing that happens because God is about justice? God is about things that are correct. And we read that story and we have a hard time filtering it correctly because it just seems like an act of revenge. But is our God a God of revenge or is he a God of holiness? And Leviticus is illustrating that in my presence, I will be held as holy. Among my people, I will be understood as holy. And so you have Nadab and Abihu, leaders of the people, who are actually held to a different standard than other people are. Did you know that? Did you know that that's true today? It's unfair, isn't it? If you presume to be a leader of God's people, you actually are held to a different standard. The New Testament writers don't even hold any punches on this one. If you presume to teach, you better watch yourself in the way you live or step down. Right? It's an amazing thing what corruption among God's people can do, but what about corruption in God's leadership? Well, that ruins everybody's faith. God knows this, and he requires and demands that his leaders will hold me as holy. They will revere me. Nadab and Abihu have a stricter standard, and they know it. They've already been warned about it. And they walk in and they do something that God has actually already said, hey, do it this, make sure you do it this way. And I don't know how much longer in the chronology this story in Leviticus 10 is, but it's not very far off. I mean, it doesn't take them very long to actually build all the stuff at the tabernacle and leave the side of the mountain. It's a year from Passover to Passover before they leave. I mean, that's the amount of time. And in that period of time, they forgot an awful lot. And then they walk into the presence of God and presume upon him, and he won't have any of it. And so the holiness of God is like, it's completely connected to his presence. So in the story, let's just flip over to 1 Kings 8. I made you turn to Leviticus, and then I didn't read anything from there. But you know what? I like to hear the Bible pages flip, or your phone's clicking or whatever. As long as you're not on Facebook right now, that's an abomination. Get off of Facebook and open your Bible, Tom. Yeah, Tom. Tom was looking at me like, what? Yeah, right, we know. Okay, so 1 Kings 8 is so 1 Kings 8 and 2 Chronicles 7, we're going to look at those really quickly, and then we'll move into the New Testament. So this is the telling of when the temple is dedicated. You remember David couldn't build the temple? What was the reason that David couldn't build the temple? Blood. It actually is, that's the main reason it's blood, right? He was a guy who shed blood, right? Isn't that funny? Because David was a man after God's own heart, right? It's his penitence about his sinfulness, his passion for serving God, and his passion for justice, right? But that passion for justice actually eliminated him from being able to build this house where God would dwell, right? So it's an interesting thing that here's a man after God's own heart, and Solomon is actually quite a bit more corrupt than David. And he is the one that's allowed to build this temple. And there are many reasons, I'm sure, why that's true. But Solomon, they bring in the 1 Kings 8, the beginning of the chapter, they bring in the ark. And let's pick up about verse 5. King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel who had assembled before him were with him before the ark, sacrificing so many sheep and oxen they could not be counted or numbered. We're going to talk about how this relates to New Testament theology in just a little bit because it's fascinating. Then the priest brought the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord to its place in the inner sanctuary of the house in the most holy place underneath the wings of the cherubim. For the cherubim spread out their wings over the place of the ark so that the cherubim overshadowed the ark and its poles. And the poles were so long that the ends of the poles were seen from the holy place before the inner sanctuary, but they could not be seen from outside. And they are there to this day. There was nothing in the ark except the 2 tablets of stone that Moses put there at Horeb, where the Lord made a covenant with the people of Israel. Now, remember, a lot of people believe there are other things in the ark, right? But this is one, and there's not the only. There's probably 5 or 6 places where it seems to indicate that the other things were not in the ark, that they were beside the ark. So there's always a war of words. But the verbs that are used to describe, and some people have translated, some translators have said that these things were in the ark, but it seems like they were best translated beside the ark. And those are the other elements, right? The staff that budded, right? So, and the manna. This seems to be the only thing in the ark, and here's one place where it's indicated that way. So when they sprinkle the blood over it, what's actually being covered? not the manna, a sign of God's provision, and not the staff that budded, another manifestation of God's protection or provision, but simply the law, right? That's an important theological point, okay? So the poles were so long. Let's see, verse 9. There was nothing in the ark except the 2 tablets of stone that Moses put there at Horeb, where the Lord made a covenant with the people of Israel. When they came out of the land of Egypt, and when the priest came to the holy place, a cloud filled the house of the Lord so that the priest could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. Do you know what the next thing happened in this story? What is it? What's your subtitle say? Solomon blesses the Lord. And after he gets done praying, which is repeated in 2 Samuel 7, verse 1 beginning, in that prayer, if you've never read Solomon's prayer at the dedication of the temple, can I challenge you to go home tonight and read it? It's something that we should memorize. It's awesome. God has provided. God has given us everything. And all their prayers always did that. They recount stories. You remember when God did this? Praise God. It's the retelling of Israel's history with the Lord. And then the next thing that happens, this is very important. The next thing that happens is they start sacrificing animals. The glory of the Lord comes into the temple. They dedicate to the Lord, and then they start sacrificing animals. And they're 22,000, I think, is one of the numbers that's given. What is it? I don't remember where it is, sorry. I sometimes mark these. Where, do you see it?
It's 50-something.
Okay, thank you. I don't know. There's 22. The number, I know there's significance to the number, so I'm not trying to downplay it, but it's not my point, but there's thousands of animals being sacrificed. The initial sacrifices they couldn't number, right? 22,000, yeah.
120,000 sheep.
There you go.
And they're rounded, which means...
Right, so it's a lot more. But the initial sacrifice was more than they could count. They can count this sacrifice. Isn't that crazy? 22 and 120,000, right? They can count that one, but they couldn't even count the first one before the ark was brought in. The ark is brought in, so the presence of God comes into his temple, and they start killing animals. Have you ever thought about what happens in the beginning of Acts? So Acts 2, you remember the disciples are gathered together and they've chosen a new someone to take the place of Judas, remember? And the people in the city hear what? Rushing wind, we talked about that last week, which is a signal of the presence of God, right? The presence of God comes down into Jerusalem so strongly that the people, just odds and ends people, come to the house where the wind is going. And then they stand outside the house, which is probably Mark's mom's house, where they gathered for the Last Supper, and they're hanging outside the house. And that's when they see what? The tongues of fire, and they hear what? The men speaking in languages that they had not known. Why do we hear them speaking in our languages? And they list off 15 different places. How come this is happening? And then Peter begins to teach them. And what happens after Peter teaches them? We use this passage a lot, but I don't know if we understand its significance. What happens after Peter goes through the history of the Jews and talks about, he's basically telling the same story that Solomon's telling in his prayer, right? Dedicating and saying, hey, there's a purpose to this. It's not people who are drunk. There's a reason for this. And then at the end of his sermon, what do they say? It says they were pierced to the heart. And they said, what should we do? And what happened? They began sacrificing themselves. Are you hearing that one? That's biblical narrative come full circle. When the tabernacle is set up, when the temple is set up, the dedication involves the killing of animals. And when the temple is set up in the people's heart, in God's God establishes this new temple. Are we the temple? Do you understand that concept? I know you do. We are the temple of God. And that began in Acts 2. When that happens, what's the result? People begin to make life sacrifices. So let me ask you this. What's the difference between the animal sacrifices that happen at the initial temple dedication and the people sacrifices that happen here? There's huge differences, right? Right. It's choice, isn't it? It's voluntary. These 22,000 or 122,000 animals that are sacrificed don't have a choice. But when God establishes himself in this new temple, which is you, the people make choices. The people around them recognize the power of God is in this place, and they begin to sacrifice themselves by giving themselves in baptism. They're dead men walking, and they are put into the grave like all dead people are, and then they are resurrected just in the image of Jesus. That is awesome. Can I tell you something? You don't have to talk about baptism to people. The reason that people are repulsed by the way we speak of baptism is because we don't understand it. We just beat it to death. But when you understand how God has set up this imagery for literally thousands of years, read the story again and you see it and wow. The narrative is awesome. I don't need to. Romans 6 is our go-to passage to talk about what happens in baptism. That is not for people who are not believers. That's for people who have already been put into the Lord. Because what he's saying is, do you not know what's happened to you that you've been baptized in the Lord? Here's what happened. You died and Christ raised you, just as he raised himself. So the theology of the Old Testament comes alive in Jesus Christ. And so in Hebrews, that's exactly what the Hebrew writer is saying. Let's go to, I'm like all over my notes here. I probably shouldn't have notes. Hebrews 4. Let's look at some New Testament passages here. I usually don't use notes, but this week was one of those weeks where I knew if I didn't write something down, I would be of no account. Hebrews 4. Look at 3 passages in Hebrews, and then we'll end in 1 Peter. Hebrews 4, verses 14 through 16. Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Skip over to chapter 9. All this stuff in Leviticus about sacrifices and priests and the function and what they do to draw the people of God into a state of holiness so that they can be in the presence of God. And we are so fortunate to not have to go through the same things because Jesus, he wasn't one aspect of that sacrificial system. So if Jesus was just the sacrifice, it's sort of like, remember we talked about the story of Isaac? Which one is Jesus? It's easy for us to see Jesus as Isaac, right? Jesus is Isaac. The father brings his son up and is going to sacrifice him, right? So Abraham is God the Father and Isaac is Jesus, right? So that's the easiest. But is that the main thing of who Jesus is? What, isn't Jesus also the ram that was over here? So Jesus portrays at least 2 of the main characters in that story, and even some non-main characters. In every story in the Old Testament, it's shadowing Jesus in some way. I mean, there's something about it that is illustrating who Jesus is. So here we go. And that's what the Hebrew writer is actually trying to say is, all that stuff, the stories we love, it's all pointing to somebody we know. Hebrews 9. Verse 24 beginning, Christ has entered not into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. Nor was it to offer himself repeatedly as the high priest enters the holy places every year with blood not his own. In other words, blood, if it was his own blood, he would have volunteered it, but it wasn't even that blood. It was the blood of some poor little innocent animal that didn't know it was getting killed. Right? For then he would have had to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world. But as it is, he has appeared once for all to the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And just as it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. Skip over one chapter to chapter 10 and begin in verse 19. Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened up for us through the curtain, that is, through his flesh. It's like, even the temple and the tabernacle are symbolic of Jesus. His body, the flesh, the curtain, the thing that brings us into the Holy of Holies, the presence of God that we're not supposed to be there, right? That curtain, remember when Jesus dies all the way, top to bottom, right? He's saying that curtain is symbolic of his flesh, right? Well, that's exactly what happens on the cross. So, the way that he opened up for us through the curtain, that is, through his flesh, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. And let's just look at one last passage because we're almost out of time here. I mean, read through Hebrews and you're going to hear especially the last chapters here. But, I mean, it really starts in, chapter 4 and 5. But when you get to chapters 8, 9, 10, 11, it's really just, who is Jesus? If everything types Jesus, let me explain how. And he just goes through the whole litany of things. Jesus isn't just the one, they had two goats, right? On the day of atonement. And what do they do with them? One gets sacrificed and one gets carried off in the wilderness, never to return, hopefully, right? Which one is Jesus? Both. Which one's the priest that pronounces the curses on the head is him. You understand? He's like playing every role in this. Does that sound right to you? Do you remember when he made his covenant with Abraham? Who went through the two halves of the animal? Only God. I will perform this. I will pronounce blessings on you. You will do nothing. So the idea that we merit God's favor through things that we do, and specifically through baptism or any other act, is ridiculous. It is simply obedience to the commands of God. You have merited nothing. God promised that he would see to it. And the two halves, so the illustration in Acts, the second chapter, is all about Genesis 12. When God makes the covenant with Abraham, and that's actually in chapter 15, but when he makes the covenant with Abraham, what does he say? That you will be a blessing to all the people of the earth. Many nations will come from you. All will be blessed, right? So there's actually like 10 facets to the promise. And what happens in Acts 2 is the ultimate exhibit of that. People from all over the world who would come to Jerusalem either to participate in the Passover, sometimes from afar because they couldn't walk into the temple grounds, and others just to see the spectacle. People from all over the world were in Jerusalem in Acts 2. And God's presence comes into probably Mark's mom's house, wherever they are. And the people from all these different nations come up and they're like, what's going on here? Because the presence of God has come like a mighty rushing wind. And then they begin to ask, how are we hearing this message in our own languages? What was the message? It's what we call the gospel. It's the good news. The good news was literally being brought to people of every nation. You know what those people did? They stayed in Jerusalem for a little while, and God had to kick them out. They were so enamored with what happened in Jerusalem with God's presence and the miracles that were being worked, they wanted to see more, so they stayed. You know how God kicked them out? Through persecution. Sometimes you can get into a place that's so good that you have to be forced to scatter and bring your blessings elsewhere. You know, it's kind of what happened to Israel, isn't it? It's being typed by Israel. Israel's enjoying God's blessings. And of course they failed, as all of us do. They failed, but through persecution, they're led into the ends of the earth. It's a type. And the early Christians, they have to leave Jerusalem, not because they want to. They want to hang out. They all stayed there, thousands and thousands. The church of Jerusalem, it was a true first megachurch. You know, if you have something against megachurches, you don't understand God. God loved that megachurch in Jerusalem. And my guess is there wasn't one place that could house them. They weren't a house church. They were meeting all over the place, and the elders were just kind of scattered abroad, taking care of everybody. That's megachurch right there. And God had to kick them out of Jerusalem to make them spread the gospel everywhere. One last passage, 1 Peter 1, and I know we're over. If you have to leave, go ahead and leave. But I'm going to read the end of chapter 1 and into chapter 2. I want you to see the connection that I think we as Christians are supposed to understand about holiness and God's presence and responsibility, okay? Because the New Testament writers, they nail this. If you I always think Peter's an idiot. You know, Peter's like a hick from some small little town. He speaks with an accent and everybody knows it. Hey, aren't you from Morgantown? Right? Or Edmondson? You know, I don't know. What do we pick on, right? I'm not from here. But, right, he would have been some hick from some little town. Oh, I know. I've heard that accent before, and you're not intellectual, so you don't belong with us, right? So that's Peter. He's not smart. And listen to him. This not smart guy, okay? 1 Peter 1, verse 13. Therefore, preparing your minds for action and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, since it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. And if you call on him as Father who judges impartially according to each one's deeds, conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of your exile. This guy's no idiot. This is spot on. The people are in exile. He's pulling them back to the time of Babylon and saying, don't forget, you don't belong here. You don't belong here, but while you're here, be a good, holy example to the people around you. Knowing that you were ransomed from the feudal ways inherited from your forefathers, not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ. You weren't bought because somebody had a lot of money. You were bought because somebody died. Like that of a lamb without blemish or spot. He was foreknown before the foundation of the world, but was made manifest in the last times for the sake of you, who through him are believers in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and hope are in God. Having purified your souls by your obedience to the truth for a sincere brotherly love, love one another earnestly from a pure heart, since you have been born again, not of perishable seed, but of imperishable, through the living and abiding word of God. For all flesh is like grass, and all its glory like the flower of grass. The grass withers and the flower falls, but the word of the Lord remains forever. And this word is the good news that was preached to you. Who was the guy that was preaching in Acts 2? Okay, it's coming full circle, isn't it? Now listen to this. Chapter 2, verse 1. So put away all malice and all deceit and hypocrisy and envy and all slander. Like newborn infants, long for the pure spiritual milk, that by it you may grow up into salvation. Grow up into salvation. if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is good. As you come to him, a living stone, rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen. He's talking about people who are not accepted. And I was making fun of Peter. I hope he understood. I'm being facetious about that. He actually was not one of the smart guys. He is empowered by the Holy Spirit of God. This is not his words. It is the Spirit speaking through him. And he's saying people reject things all the time, but because of the power of God, there's no reason. And he says, as you come to him, a living stone rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen and precious, you yourselves like living stones are being built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. And he goes on to expand more. But I hope you're getting the point, is that this guy who is preaching in Acts 2 is furthering his explanation of the gospel. That the gospel is not intended to just make you feel good. It's intended to help you be good, to make you good. And are you doing it? No. And the beauty of the new sacrifice is, because someone did it voluntarily, you don't have to. You just have to want to. It's about desire. It's about what you want to be. And that's the idea of walking in the light. When I walk in the light, I'm walking towards God. I'm not rejecting his will. I stumble in many ways all along the path, but all through that time, God is sanctifying me for his purpose. Do you know that Leviticus is not primarily talking about, all the stuff that's listed in Leviticus is not saying that these people were now not his children because they had sinned. That's actually not what Leviticus is saying. It's saying that they were made common or unclean. But are they still purposeful? Can they be brought back into the state of holy? Yeah. They're not rejected and outside the camp. They've messed some things up. They've become soiled or dirty. And that's actually what sin does in your life. Sin doesn't make you a reject out of the house of God. 1 John is written to explain that to us and make us realize that there's a difference between the sin I commit and the sin people in the world commit. My life is directed towards God. And my sin does not lead me to death, not any longer, because I'm washed with the continual flow of blood from Jesus. 1 John is the evidence of that fact. Sorry, we're way over. Thank you for, most of you didn't leave. I know a few of you, just are pagan and left anyway, but no. Hey, thank you for sticking around. I hope you're getting something out of the presence, and we'll continue on next week. Thanks again.